So we're on the first day of our happiness retreat, and as you know, the discourse of on happiness is one of the central teachings in the Plum Village tradition. And I think it's quite interesting that Thai chose to translate Mahamangala, which is the Pali name of the sutta, as the discourse on happiness. Literally, it means the greatest blessings. But I think Thai was very much at pains to make things as accessible as possible. And I think that's why he used the term happiness. And I know that the very first thing that I heard Thai say on a retreat years ago down in South Devon was he was talking about our practice, and he said, you know, if your practice is not bringing you peace and happiness, you're not really practicing. And I'd already practiced for 7 years in a different tradition, and when I heard him say that, I cried because I knew that I couldn't say that about my practice. And it's become a really central theme of the practice for me, this connection with happiness. And the discourse on happiness is very much there to help us to see the world in that way, because actually we know from studies in psychology that happiness is actually a really powerful state that's actually really helpful in our ability to change, to respond to situations, not to get caught in, you know, the minutiae and the difficulties of life, but actually to be able to progress positively through life. So, as I say, it was very important for me to hear Thai talk about happiness in that way. Somebody, one of these apocryphal Zen stories, you know, that somebody asked a Zen master, you know, what's the constant activity of all Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? Essentially, you know, what's so special about the life of an awakened being? And the master replied that the constant activity of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas was to respond appropriately to whatever came. And that's our path for all of us, of course. And I think that's very much what the discourse on happiness is trying to help us to do. It's trying to help us to find that way of responding appropriately to situations and not to get caught. So I'm going to go through the discourse and pick out certain sections and talk about some of those. So it starts, of course, with the introductory words. I heard these words of the Buddha one time when the Lord was living in the vicinity of Savatthi at the Anathapindika monastery in the Jeta Grove. Late at night, a deva appeared whose light and beauty made the whole Jeta Grove shine radiantly. After paying respects to the Buddha, the deva asked him a question in the form of a verse. Many gods and men are eager to know what are the greatest blessings, which bring about a peaceful and happy life. Please, Tathagata, will you teach us? And this is the Buddha's answer. Not to be associated with the foolish ones, to live in the company of wise people, honoring those who are worth honoring. This is the greatest happiness. Now, of course, we can't choose who we meet in everyday life. We may have some control over some aspects of that, but if we can choose who we choose. We can choose who we want to hang out with. So, the Buddha is encouraging us to be selective about who we hang out with. And if we choose a nourishing environment to be part of, then that will support our stability, our ease and our freedom. So being part of a Sangha is very helpful in that respect. But of course there are many other communities, many other traditions which also offer this support. People who fail to connect with the positive elements in society around them are very prone to fall into crime, abuse, fear, addiction, or indeed getting lost. The Dharma talks about hungry ghosts, those who are looking for meaning in life and are not finding it. And we have the option. We always have a choice. Do we go for the meaningful life, or do we just live a life of dispersion and unsatisfactoriness? So we have to kind of make those choices on a daily basis. The sutra also talks about honoring those who are worth honoring. And of course, part of our practice is to honor things that can help us with our practice. That's why when we come into the shrine room, we bow to the Buddha. We're actually honoring the Buddha inside of ourselves by paying respect to the Buddha, and paying respect to other people who are practicing with us. We're also supporting ourselves. So the more respect we give to something or someone, the more it gives back to us. We have, our minds contain mirror neurons. If we are offering respect to something, then, or to someone, and that person is responding respectfully to us, then that increases our level of respect. So we have that capacity to support ourselves by honoring the things and the people who can help us in our lives. So the sutra goes on. To live in a good environment, to have planted good seeds, and to realize that you're on the right path, this is the greatest happiness. I think to have a good environment is a great blessing, and particularly for children. It's a really important part of their development, is the environment in which they find themselves. Like many kids, I had some difficulties with my mother, particularly as I got into my teenage. But I remain very grateful to my parents for providing me with a healthy and stable environment in which to grow up. And I recognize the fact that, where I am now is a continuation of that. That they actually offered me that to support the rest of my life. Some years ago, I was involved with prison visiting, And it was a very interesting and powerful thing to do. And I certainly formed the distinct impression that many of the people that I met in prison, those who were incarcerated, had not had the benefits of a good environment when they were growing up, or indeed in their adult life. And so they'd slipped into crime in one way or another. And I think that's something that really influenced the way I interacted with people in prison, was to realize that actually, if I had had their upbringing, it could just as easily have been them visiting me in prison. Yeah? And that was a really helpful perspective, because it helped me to let go of judging other people. The sutra talks about being on the right path. And in Zen practice, we have confidence in our practice. Yeah? In the Zen tradition, we are not looking to something external. You know, it's referred to as an esoteric practice, because we're actually grounded in our practice. Our practice is the thing that we have faith in. It's not an exoteric practice in which we need to have, you know, gods or, you know, figureheads to look to solve our problems. As I say, it's a practice that we have come to, many of us, because we had difficulties in our lives, and it offers us the capacity to work through those difficulties without having to call on some supernatural agency to help us. To have a chance to learn and grow, to be skillful in your profession or craft, practicing the precepts and loving speech. This is the greatest happiness. So having a profession or craft, having a right livelihood that doesn't hurt others or the environment, is a great gift. We can learn and express our compassion in our work. I'm a veterinary surgeon, and I remember shortly after I became involved with this tradition, being on a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, and one of my former students was there. And in the question and answer, she asked Thai, I'm a veterinarian, is it okay? Because I know that part of my job is to take life. It seems to go against the mindfulness trainings. What should I do? And there was a kind of shocked silence in the room when she asked that question. But in fact, Thai's answer was very pragmatic, very sensible. He said, your profession needs people who practice mindfulness. Bring your mindfulness to those difficult situations, and it will help you to make the right decisions, to be kind to the animals, to be kind to the people involved. And that was very helpful for me as well. I hadn't thought to ask that question, but it was really helpful for me in seeing a way forward in my profession. So it talks about practicing the precepts and loving speech. Well, of course, these days we tend to talk about mindfulness trainings rather than precepts. Thai was aware that precepts kind of felt a bit heavy to some of us in the West, and so he decided that mindfulness trainings would be a better way to express it. And loving speech, of course, is something that requires self-awareness, but also awareness of the person to whom we're speaking. We need to be aware of where that person is coming from, what level they're operating on, so that we can speak in an appropriate way. Sometimes we find ourselves in difficult situations in which maybe the other person is angry, maybe even be angry with me. And it's very easy to get caught up in that anger. But if we're mindful and we can practice loving speech, then actually we can defuse the situation by the way in which we respond, not meeting anger with anger, but actually helping to diffuse the situation by responding sometimes to what's behind the anger rather than just the words of anger that are being expressed. To be able to serve and support your parents, to cherish your own family, and have a vocation that brings you joy. This is the greatest happiness. Of course, as we grow up, our parents are getting older, and they may need support. Of course, we all need support at times. It may be emotional support. It may be physical support. It may even be financial support at the end of their lives. But in supporting our parents, of course, we're also supporting ourselves, because our parents are not only outside of us, but also within us. And if we support our parents outside of us, then we're actually supporting that of our parents inside of ourselves. So this is very much in the spirit of interbeing. You know, there is no separate self. That's a really important part of our practice, is recognizing that we don't have a separate self. If you read the Diamond Sutra, this is really at the heart of the Diamond Sutra, that human beings do not have a separate self. We're not separate from other people. We're not separate from other living beings. We're not separate from the rest of the earth. So it's very important, I think, to recognize that element in our practice. And Thai invented this term, interbeing, by which he was expressing that idea of interconnectedness between things, the impermanent and empty nature of existence. Impermanent because everything comes from somewhere and goes to something else, and empty because it is empty of a separate existence. So, to say, Thai summed that up in this interbeing. We inter-are. I am in you as you are in me. if you weren't here, I shouldn't be talking. To live honestly, generous in giving, to offer support to relatives and friends, living a life of blameless conduct, this is the greatest happiness. So honesty, yes. Generous, again, generosity is again coming back to this spirit of interbeing. You know, what comes around goes around. What we give, we also receive. We might give money or material resources or technical knowledge or share our time with others. But we need to give without expectation of a return. There's a slightly odd story told of the time of the Buddha, and it's just a myth. But you know, the Buddha is walking through India with Ananda, his attendant, one day, and a beggar asks him. Beggar is blind, and the beggar asks the Buddha to give him the gift of an eye. And without thinking, the Buddha plucks an eye out and gives it to the beggar, who drops it on the ground and stamps on it. And Ananda, of course, who's very protective of the Buddha, has to say something. And the Buddha said, "It's okay, Ananda. The gift is given." Yeah, he's not looking for any return. Yeah, and that's the way in which we offer our generosity, is not looking for a return. So, as I say, we may offer something material to somebody. At the moment, of course, there's the results of the earthquake in Syria, Turkey, and many people are contributing. British people actually have a great reputation for supporting disasters. And I'm really pleased to see that the British government has offered to match funding up to £5 million for people's gifts. So that's one way in which we can be generous, if we can afford it. But there are other ways of being generous. The second way, it says in the Dharma, is to share the teaching with other people. The teaching of peace and happiness with other people. It talks about sharing the Dharma, but of course we don't have to offer that in Dharmic terms to somebody who might not understand or is not part of this tradition. But we can still help people to touch peace and happiness in their everyday lives by what we say. As I say, I had difficulty with my mother. She had a very rigid Christian faith and was extremely offended at my involvement with Buddhism, to the extent that she blanked it out completely. And she was really, you know, I think the first time I went to Plum Village, I realized that actually the practice had the capacity to help us to heal our relationship. And I tried to talk to her about it, and she completely blanked me. It was a very painful experience. And I went away and I reflected on that. And then I realized that actually the practice is to practice. It's not to talk about the practice. And I realized that what I needed to do was to look at what my mother needed from me. And what she needed to know was that she was loved. She created this barrier, and that actually was causing her a lot of pain because she felt that she'd lost me. And so for the rest of her life, I continued to try to show her that I loved her, and I never talked about the Dharma again. And just before she died, a few months before she died, I was going to Plum Village on retreat. And I was really surprised one evening when she rang me up. She never rang me up. It was part of her control. She rang me up to say that she hoped I had a good retreat. And it meant a lot. She had understood. So we don't have to talk about the Dharma in terms of the Dharma. The third kind of generosity is being able to live without fear and to offer that to other people, to help them to do the same. I've been very lucky in my life. I've had two people who I was close to who died without fear. And that has made it possible for me to be with people who are dying without feeling frightened. That was a great gift. And those who are working with people who are ill or dying in the hospice movement and things like that, that is what they can offer, is fearlessness in the face of death. And it's a wonderful gift to be able to offer. It says, living a life of blameless conduct, that's the greatest happiness. And of course we don't all live lives of blameless conduct. We all make mistakes. And sometimes we feel guilty about things that we've said or done. Guilt in itself is not really a very helpful emotion. We tend to get locked into that feeling of guilt. But if we reflect on what's happened and what we've done, so that we can try and do better next time, that can be really helpful. When I first went to Plum Village, some of the people who went there were American GIs, American Vietnam vets, who had been involved in the Vietnam War, and many of them carried enormous burdens of guilt about what they'd done, things that had happened. And I remember one person asking Thai about the fact that he'd killed children in Vietnam. And he'd been lost ever since. He'd turned to drugs. He'd lived in the Middle East, operating as a drug dealer, just to try to kind of anesthetize himself to what he'd done. And Thai offered him a way forward. He suggested that because his guilt was around children, that he should consider sponsoring children who didn't have any support in their lives from Vietnam or from anywhere else in the world, but actually offering them the support that would help him and to help them to actually transform the situation in his mind. It was very powerful, and it really worked for this guy too. I saw it over time. To avoid unwholesome actions, not caught by alcoholism or drugs, to be diligent in doing good things. This is the greatest happiness. Loneliness and despair are common in our society, particularly amongst people who find no meaning in their lives. And it's very easy in our society to turn to things that make us seem temporary, seem less distressed. So unmindful consumption of things like alcohol or drugs offer a temporary anesthetic. They don't solve the problem. They tend to make things worse in the longer term. And of course, if we start resorting to things that offer only a temporary anesthetic, and it might be alcohol or drugs, or it might be food issues, overeating, undereating, pornography. Those are things which actually further undermine our sense of happiness and stability. And they don't actually help us to deal with the underlying issue. And of course, if we don't deal with those underlying issues, that leads us to behave in unmindful ways with regard to other people and the environment. And those actions further isolate us from other people. We have to find ways to reconnect with those around us. And negative emotions all tend to push us out of connection with other people. We need to find ways to reconnect. Meditation practice can really help us. It's not difficult, it's not easy when we're feeling distressed to meditate, because actually when we sit down to practice, our minds are filled with the things that are distressing us. Stuff comes up. I've certainly found walking meditation is much more helpful for me if I find myself distressed. Some kind of physical activity in which our body is becoming calmer also then helps our mind to become calm. And if our minds can become calm, then we can connect with that sense of peace and compassion within ourselves. And out of that, happiness can arise again. Happiness is an emergent property. It's not something we can grasp. We may get temporary sense of satisfaction out of a new phone or a new computer or a new friendship, whatever it is. But actually, sustainable happiness is something that arises out of a quiet mind. It's an emergent property, not something that we can pluck out at will by going to buy the latest gadget. To be humble and polite in manner, to be grateful and content with a simple life, not missing the occasion to learn the Dharma. This is the greatest happiness. We live in a world of increasing complexity. All the latest gadgetry makes life more and more difficult in the longer term, more and more complicated, and tends to drive us away from our humanity. We have to be careful about these things. They can be great tools, but they can be very bad masters. And we have to be really careful. And in many ways, this complex life that we've developed doesn't offer us a great deal of satisfaction. We find ourselves rushing from one activity to another. You know, it's become almost impossible for a person starting out in life on a single salary to own their own home. Yeah. It's fine for those who have the money, but it's tough on those who don't. And the world seems to be moving increasingly in that direction, that those who have are benefiting at the expense of those who have not. And we need, not just from a social point of view, to do something about that, but from an environmental point of view too. We're destroying the earth at a rate that is quite unsustainable. If we don't stop consuming, there's not going to be much left for future generations. We really have to look very carefully at how we live. To be grateful and content with a simple life. I've done a lot of wild camping in my time, and I know that one of the great things about going off into the wild with only what I can carry on my back is that life becomes a lot simpler. I can't carry with me all the things that I normally have around me at home. And after 3 or 4 days living that simple life, my mind becomes quiet. I stopped having this constant commentary about what's going on, about who's doing what to whom, and whether I like this or whether I don't. I've become much more open. And my energy is renewed by doing that. And we can use a retreat in the same way. We came here with, a bag, maybe 2 bags, and without all the complexity. We have a schedule to follow. We don't have to worry about what we're going to do next. We just follow the schedule. We have kind, mindful people around us to support us in that practice. And yeah, we have, a wonderful variety of food offered to us. We have the choice. We don't have to get lost in that. We can select what we know is good for our bodies and let go of things that we might be attracted to, but we know are not good for us. This is my constant practice when I'm on the retreat. And if we can operate in that way, our capacity for non-judging becomes greater. Not commenting, oh, that person's plate is fuller than mine, or they've got a such and such. Yeah? Okay, just let it go. And if we can do that, then our minds can relax and we can become the person we really would like to be: kind, compassionate, open. Thai always says that, a retreat is not just a retreat, it's a treat. And it's good to think of it in those terms. To persevere and be open to change. To have regular contact with monks and nuns. And to participate fully in Dharma discussions. This is the greatest happiness. Well, we will have the opportunity for Dharma discussions. We don't have any monks or nuns here. You'll have to make do with Terry and I. But hopefully that'll keep you going for the time being. To live diligently and attentively, to perceive the noble truths, and to realize Nirvana, this is the greatest happiness. So there's lots of misconceptions about Nirvana. Thai sometimes translated Nirvana as beyond thoughts, beyond conception. Yeah. And I think that's actually quite a helpful way of looking at it. It's not, heaven and the hereafter. It's available to us here and now if we can allow our minds to become quiet and kind. And of course, Nirvana is one thing. Samsara, the sort of mundane world, is all too often something different. But in fact, they're not different. It's a question of how we interact with the mundane world as to whether we experience nirvana or samsara. There's an analogy that Thai uses sometimes. I think it's probably a proverb in Vietnam, but it says that in hell there are lots of beings and lots of food, but the beings all have very short arms and extremely long chopsticks, so that they can't actually put the food in their mouths. And in heaven, the scenario is the same, but people are feeding each other with their chopsticks. And I think that's quite a nice analogy. I came across another one recently, which is interesting. It's a story about Zen master Hakuin, who's an 18th century Zen master in Japan, who was actually in the Rinzai tradition, so very much using actions as teachings. And one day he was walking and a samurai warrior came up to him and asked him, "Is there really a heaven and hell?" And Hakuin said, "Who are you that's asking this?" And the samurai said, "I'm a soldier." And Hakuin says, "You don't look like a soldier to me, you look like a beggar." As the samurai starts to get angry and starts to draw his sword. And Hakuin says, "And your sword's probably too blunt to cut my head off anyway." So the samurai is there with his sword upraised. And Hakuin says, "Here open the gates of hell." And the samurai drops his sword. And tears come to his eyes because he realized he was on the edge of hell. And Hakuin says, "And here open the gates of heaven." We always have that choice in our lives. To live in the world with your heart undisturbed by the world, with all sorrows ended, dwelling in peace. This is the greatest happiness. We live in a world that's imperfect, and it will present us with challenges. And if we don't know how to manage those challenges, we will suffer, and so will other people. Of course, the external world presents us with challenges, but so does the internal world, what's happening in our minds. In the Sarasa Sutta, it talks about the first and second arrows. When something happens that causes us to suffer, that's one thing. But as the Buddha said, that's the first arrow. If you hit in the same place by a second arrow, how is the suffering compared with the suffering after the first arrow? And the monks replied, "Oh, it would be 100 times more." And the Buddha said, "Well, the first arrow is what happens in life. The second arrow is up to you. It's whether you choose to respond in a mindful way or a reactive way. If you respond in a reactive way and you start trying to push away the suffering, trying to blame someone else for it, then actually your suffering is going to be greatly increased. I came across a book a long time ago that says, it was very simple. It was a book that had maybe only 1 or 2 lines on each page. And one of the lines was, you cannot afford the luxury of a negative thought. It's a tall order, but it's a very sensible thought, because negativity leads to more negativity. If we can let go of negativity, life becomes much more positive, much more enjoyable, even in the face of great difficulty. He or she who accomplishes this, unvanquished wherever she goes, always he is safe and happy. Happiness lives within oneself. So in the modern world, we spend a lot of our time in concepts and thinking. And the difficulty with that is not that there's anything wrong with concepts and thinking. Concepts, of course, are quite limited. They tend to be quite restricted. But thinking is sometimes really helpful and necessary. But the problem is that we get into the habit of thinking. We think all the time. We experience it when we do sitting meditation. Who of us doesn't have our mind wandering at times? Yeah? And the way in which we're living makes that more challenging. Some years ago, I moved from being a veterinary surgeon to working as a boat builder. And I was amazed at the effect that it had on my mind. You know, if I spent the day rubbing a boat down, it was as good as meditation. My mind became quiet as long as I stopped kind of counting how many minutes it was going to take me to get it done, get it finished. Whereas working as a vet, particularly working in the university, I was constantly working with ideas and thoughts. And it was almost impossible to switch off at night. You know, I lost a lot of sleep worrying about my cases, worrying about things that were happening. And as I say, when we practice meditation, we're opening up a different part of our brain's processing capacity. Rather than the areas of the left cerebral hemisphere that are associated with thinking, we're actually giving power to the areas in the right hemisphere which give us agency over our lives, which give us the capacity to be mindful in difficult situations. And out of that can come a much greater sense of peace, contentment, and happiness. Thank you very much.